A cocky judge, a ruthless prosecutor, a defendant who's not just fighting for his freedom, but for the truth. When 19-year-old Ethan Carter steps into court, everyone thinks he's just another guilty kid. But what they don't know, he's about to turn this trial upside down. Betrayal, corruption, a shocking twist no one saw coming. Can Ethan outsmart the system before it buries him? Watch until the end to find out. Like and subscribe for more mind-blowing stories. The trial that could destroy a life. Los Angeles County Courthouse. 10:15 a.m. The wooden doors of Courtroom 3 slammed shut with a resounding thud, sealing the fate of 19-year-old Ethan Carter. At least that's what everyone in that room thought. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of suffocating weight that wrapped around your throat, making it hard to breathe. The gallery was packed. Lawyers, law students, reporters, and a few familiar faces from Ethan's neighborhood crammed into the seats, whispering among themselves. That kid's done for. Judge Grayson never goes easy on cases like this. Did you hear? They caught him red-handed. In the front row, an older woman sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, fingers trembling slightly. Denise Carter, Ethan's mother. She hadn't blinked since she sat down. Her boy, her brilliant, stubborn boy, was on trial. And if he lost, he wouldn't be coming home. The defendant, Ethan, stood at the defendant's table, his hands shoved casually into the pockets of his slacks, his shoulders squared. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance nervously around the room. He didn't even shift his weight. Because Ethan Carter wasn't afraid. But he should have been. Across from him, Mitchell Carrington, the state prosecutor, adjusted his silk tie, his face smug. He was the kind of man who wore confidence like armor. Not because he was invincible, but because he'd never been hit hard enough to doubt himself. And today, he didn't expect to get hit at all. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carrington began, his voice smooth, commanding, too rehearsed. "Today is an open and shut case." He turned slightly, throwing a condescending glance at Ethan. The defendant, Ethan Carter, was found inside a stolen Audi A6. His fingerprints were on the steering wheel. When the police attempted to pull him over, he fled. Carrington paced a little, his polished black shoes clicking against the tile floor. "He ran, Your Honor." He stopped, turning to face the jury. "What kind of innocent person runs?" Silence. It was a rhetorical question. He wanted to hang in the air, to settle into the minds of the jurors like an undeniable truth. Innocent people don't run. And just like that, the trap was set. The judge. At the head of the room, Judge Richard Grayson leaned back in his chair, observing the scene like a king watching gladiators fight in his arena. His silver-rimmed glasses sat low on his nose as he looked at Ethan. There was something different about this one. Most defendants? They slumped in their seats, waiting for the hammer to drop. Some of them cried, some of them pleaded, and some just accepted their fate. But this kid? Grayson could tell he wasn't broken yet. That intrigued him, but it also irritated him. With a heavy sigh, the judge drummed his fingers against the bench. "Mr. Carter, do you have representation, or are we going to waste even more time?" A nervous-looking woman beside Ethan quickly stood up. Lisa Thornton. She was a public defender, fresh out of law school, and her hands were already shaking. She hadn't even spoken yet, but Ethan already knew she wouldn't be able to help him. "Your Honor," she began, "my client—" Ethan lifted a hand, stopping her. "I'll be representing myself." The entire courtroom went silent. The reporters stopped taking notes. The jurors shifted uncomfortably. Even the bailiff, who had seen every kind of dumb decision in that room, raised an eyebrow. And Judge Grayson? He laughed. "Excuse me?" Ethan met his gaze head-on. "I said I'll be defending myself." Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, this ought to be good." Carrington smirked. "Kid, I hope you like losing." "Ethan," he smirked right back, "we'll see." And just like that, the real battle began. The first strike, Judge Grayson sighed, flipping through Ethan's case file with a lazy indifference. "All right, let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. More chuckles from the gallery. Ethan caught it immediately. The first mistake. The judge didn't care about this trial. He assumed it was already over. That meant he wasn't paying attention. And that meant Ethan had an opening. Carrington stood again, confident, rehearsed, predictable. Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant was caught in a stolen vehicle. He turned, looking directly at Ethan for the first time. There is no debate here. The evidence is ironclad. Ethan said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he let Carrington keep talking. He let him get comfortable, because comfortable people made mistakes. The prosecutor stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back. We have testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel. Carrington smiled like he had just played his winning card. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all we need. Judge Grayson nodded. Sounds pretty straightforward to me. For most people in the room, it probably did. But Ethan Carter wasn't most people, and he had just found the second mistake. He exhaled slowly, then he stepped forward. Your Honor, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington barely looked up from his papers. Go ahead, kid. Ethan's hands were still in his pockets as he tilted his head slightly. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel, correct? Carrington sighed. Yes, that's right. Ethan nodded. And his testimony is written in his report? Obviously. Ethan smiled. Then he pulled his hands from his pockets and dropped a bombshell. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Grayson narrowed his eyes. On what grounds? Ethan's voice was calm, confident, and lethal. Because Officer Ruiz was never at the crime scene. Carrington stiffened. The battle had begun. The courtroom turns against him. The moment Ethan Carter dropped his bombshell, the room changed. The laughter stopped. The whispers grew louder. And the prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, wasn't smiling anymore. Excuse me, Carrington said, narrowing his eyes. Ethan took a slow step forward, keeping his tone calm but sharp, letting his words cut through the tension like a blade. Officer Daniel Ruiz didn't see me behind the wheel that night, because he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Carrington's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. He waved a dismissive hand. The report clearly states, the report is wrong. Ethan turned to Judge Grayson, locking eyes with him. Your Honor, I request a subpoena for Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. Judge Grayson, who had spent most of the morning bored, now sat up a little straighter. He turned to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any objections? For the first time, Carrington hesitated. It was only a second, a fraction of a moment, but it was enough. Because the jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. Carrington cleared his throat, gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. No objections, Your Honor. But it didn't matter anymore, because the shift had already begun. The chess match begins. Ethan didn't celebrate. Not yet. Winning a single point against the prosecution wasn't enough, not in a system designed to destroy people like him. Fine, Carrington said, flipping through his stack of papers. While we wait for the GPS records, let's talk about the evidence that can't be disputed. He turned back to the jury, his voice shifting into that smooth, rehearsed tone. The fingerprints. He took a few slow, calculated steps toward the jury box. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That's not speculation. That's forensic proof. And the defense would like to respond. Ethan's voice was steady, measured. Judge Grayson gave him a nod. Proceed. Ethan turned to the jury, his gaze sweeping across their faces. Let's talk about that fingerprint evidence. He clasped his hands behind his back, shifting his weight slightly. The prosecution wants you to believe that fingerprints on a steering wheel mean I stole the car. He let that sentence hang in the air for a moment. Then he shook his head, almost amused. But let's use common sense. He turned, looking directly at one of the jurors, a woman in her mid-40s who had been watching him closely. Say you go to a department store. You see a jacket you like, so you pick it up. You put your hands in the pockets. Maybe you zip it up. She nodded slightly. Then you decide not to buy it. You put it back and walk out. He paused. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket. The police check for fingerprints. They find yours. He let that sit. Then he asked slowly, does that mean you stole the jacket? The jurors exchanged glances. A few in the gallery whispered. Ethan pressed forward. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven that night. He glanced at the judge. Your Honor, there's security footage confirming that I was inside the store with my friends. Judge Grayson arched an eyebrow. Continue. When we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I opened the door because it was already unlocked. Ethan shrugged. Stupid? Yeah, a crime? Number Carrington's lips pressed into a thin line. That's a nice story, kid, but there's just one problem. He turned back toward Judge Grayson. The forensic analyst confirmed that the fingerprints were on the steering wheel, not the door handle. Ethan gave a slow nod. And was the forensic specialist subpoenaed to testify today? Carrington blinked. What? You heard me, Ethan said. Was the forensic specialist subpoenaed to testify? Carrington hesitated, then reluctantly, no. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? Judge Grayson let out a slow breath and rubbed his temple. He was realizing it now. This wasn't going to be the easy win he thought it would be. The turning point, Ethan took a slow step forward. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. The gallery stirred. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Ethan nodded, pulling out a printed transcript from his file. Yes, Your Honor. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police. And I think I know why the prosecution never mentioned it. Carrington stiffened. Ethan turned to the jury, his voice calm. Here's what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen. Then he read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. The courtroom exploded. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. Order! Order! But the damage was done. Ethan turned back to Carrington. The arresting officer left this out of his report. The prosecution ignored it. He let that sink in. And yet they expect this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Carrington tried to recover. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Ethan cut him off. No, it isn't. His voice was calm, but it hit like a hammer. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Grayson rubbed his temple again. He sighed. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington was stiff. His face flushed. No, Your Honor. The unexpected betrayal. For a moment, the courtroom felt frozen in time. Judge Grayson was rubbing his temple, his frustration growing by the second. The jury sat in uncomfortable silence, shifting in their seats as the weight of doubt settled in. The gallery whispered among themselves. This case wasn't as simple as they thought. And then, the trap was sprung. A sudden turn. Mitchell Carrington, the prosecution, stood up slowly. His once pristine confidence had cracked, but he wasn't done. Not yet. He cleared his throat and turned to Judge Grayson, his voice measured, controlled. Your Honor, I have one more witness. Ethan's stomach dropped. Number Carrington's lips curled into a smirk. The prosecution calls Jackson Miller. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and in walked Ethan's best friend. The betrayal Ethan stiffened. Jackson wouldn't do this. Would he? Jackson walked to the witness stand, his steps hesitant, but he never looked at Ethan. Something was wrong. Judge Grayson eyed Carrington. Miller, state your full name for the record. Jackson Lee Miller. His voice wavered. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had to think. Jackson wasn't just a friend. He was practically family. They had grown up together, spent late nights debating law cases for fun, talked about starting a firm together one day, and now he was testifying against him. Carrington didn't waste time. Mr. Miller, do you recognize the defendant? Jackson nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. Ethan Carter. Was my best friend. The past tense hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Carrington kept going, his tone casual. Too casual. "Mr. Miller, where were you on the night of the alleged crime?" Jackson hesitated. Ethan held his breath. Finally, Jackson answered, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw Ethan in the Audi." The courtroom erupted. Ethan couldn't move. Jackson's words rang in his ears like a gunshot. "Number no, no, no." Carrington was smiling again. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Ethan felt like the ground was collapsing beneath him. Jackson was lying. But why? The breakdown Carrington walked toward Jackson, his face filled with false sympathy. "Jackson, I understand this must be hard for you." Ethan's hands tightened into fists. Carrington continued, his voice soft, calculated. "But we need the truth. Did Ethan Carter steal that car?" Jackson swallowed hard. For a brief second, his eyes flicked toward Ethan. Then, yes. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the chest. Betrayed. Judge Grayson leaned forward, studying Jackson. "Are you absolutely certain, Mr. Miller?" Jackson nodded, though his body language screamed discomfort. "I saw him inside the car before the police arrived." The jury members shifted uncomfortably. Carrington took a step back. His job done. "No further questions, Your Honor." The fight to recover. Judge Grayson turned to Ethan. "Mr. Carter, you may cross-examine the witness." Ethan's pulse thundered. His mind raced. If he lost control now, if he got angry, if he made a single misstep, it was over. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. And then he stood. Jackson. Jackson still wouldn't look at him. Ethan stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. "You and I have known each other since we were kids." No response. "We studied law together." Still nothing. "You know what perjury is, right? A flicker of something, guilt?" flashed in Jackson's eyes. Ethan pressed forward. "You're under oath, Jackson, which means if you lie, you could be the one facing charges." Jackson's hands tightened in his lap. "I know. Then let me ask you again." Ethan's voice was calm but sharp as a blade. "Did you really see me inside that car?" Jackson's breath hitched. His fingers twitched. For a split second, Ethan saw it. Doubt, fear, guilt. Something was forcing Jackson to lie, and Ethan was going to rip it apart. The cracks began to show. "Who told you to say this?" Ethan asked. Jackson stiffened. Carrington's smirk faltered. "Objection!" Carrington snapped, leading the witness. Judge Grayson hesitated. Ethan turned to him. "Your Honor, the prosecution is relying on this testimony as critical evidence. I have the right to question the credibility of this witness." Grayson exhaled, then nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." Ethan faced Jackson again. "Tell me the truth, Jackson." Jackson hesitated. The entire room was holding its breath. Then, Carrington's eyes darkened. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness." Ethan spun around. "Are you afraid, Jackson?" Jackson flinched. Ethan took a slow step closer. "What did they promise you?" The courtroom gasped. Judge Grayson leaned forward. Jackson's hands were trembling now. Carrington was furious. "This is ridiculous." Ethan kept his voice steady. "You know this is wrong, Jackson." Jackson's breathing became shallow. And then, "They said if I didn't testify against you, they'd charge me too." Boom! The courtroom exploded in chaos. Judge Grayson slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Ethan just stood there, watching it all unravel. Because now he had everything he needed, and he was about to turn this trial upside down. The final blow, the courtroom was in chaos. Judge Grayson's gavel slammed down like a gunshot. "Order! Order in the court!" But it didn't matter, because the damage was already done. Ethan Carter stood in the center of it all, unmoving. Jackson had just exposed everything. The police, the prosecution, the system. They had tried to break him, and now they were the ones breaking. The collapse of the prosecution. Judge Grayson turned to Carrington, his face unreadable. "Mr. Carrington, do you wish to address the court regarding these allegations?" Carrington's jaw was clenched so tight It looked like his teeth might shatter. Your Honor, this is nonsense. The prosecution has no knowledge of any coercion against this witness. Ethan smirked. That's interesting. He turned back to the jury. Because when I asked Jackson a direct question, he didn't hesitate. He didn't stall. He didn't fumble. He told the truth. Jackson sat at the witness stand looking guilty, ashamed but relieved. Ethan walked toward the prosecution's table. Deliberate, calculated, ready to end this. The state wanted a conviction so badly they were willing to destroy an innocent man's life. He turned back to the jury, his voice rising. They ignored exculpatory evidence. They buried the owner's testimony. They relied on a coerced witness. Then he looked directly at Judge Grayson. And they expected this court to just go along with it. The final proof, Ethan wasn't done. Your Honor, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence. Judge Grayson rubbed his forehead. Proceed. Ethan walked over to the defense table and picked up a sealed envelope. This is a copy of Officer Daniel Ruiz's GPS logs from the night of my arrest. Carrington stiffened. Your Honor, this is... Let's not waste any more time. Ethan tore open the envelope and held up the printed logs. According to these records, Officer Ruiz was never anywhere near the crime scene at the time of my arrest. The courtroom went dead silent. Judge Grayson took a long breath, then slowly turned to Carrington. Mr. Carrington, would you care to explain why an officer whose testimony was used as the cornerstone of your case was not actually present at the time of the alleged crime? Carrington had no answer, because there was no answer. And just like that, the case collapsed. The verdict Judge Grayson tapped his fingers against the bench. Then he leaned forward. In light of the overwhelming contradictions in the prosecution's case, the coerced testimony, and the fact that critical evidence was withheld, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against the defendant. Silence. Then, the courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, reporters scrambling to take notes. Ethan didn't move, because he knew he had won. The aftermath, as the courtroom emptied, Ethan stepped outside into the blinding California sun. Reporters swarmed him immediately. Ethan, did you know you were going to win? How does it feel to outsmart the prosecution? What are you going to do next? Ethan ignored them, because the only person who mattered was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother, Denise Carter. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then finally, she let out a long breath and shook her head. Boy, you scared me half to death. Ethan chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, but Ethan wasn't paying attention anymore. The judge's final words. Across the street, Judge Grayson stood by his car, watching. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. Finally, he spoke. Carter. Ethan turned. For the first time, Grayson looked at him like an equal. Then after a long pause, the judge gave a single nod. You should consider law school. Ethan smiled. I don't need to consider it. He slipped his hands into his pockets. I'll see you in court again, Your Honor. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. The bigger picture. As Ethan walked away, a single thought echoed in his mind. How many others had sat in that courtroom, wrongly accused? How many never got the chance to fight back? How many innocent people were sitting behind bars right now, just because they didn't know the law? Ethan had been lucky, but next time, it might not be him. It might be someone you know. And if that day ever comes, who will fight for them? The end, or just the beginning? Share this story, because the justice system isn't just about laws. It's about people, and people can change, but only if we make them.